On August 27th, 2015, my sister and I began a cross-country road trip from my parents' home in California's Central Valley all the way to move me into seminary at Gordon-Conwell. We took 11 days and the most illogical route possible. Starting in California, going up to South Dakota, all the way down to North Carolina, and then all the way back up to Massachusetts. And on the 10th day, the day before I would move into my brand new dorm room and retreat house, we're driving through Connecticut. In the middle of a lighthearted conversation, I blurt out, "I don't want to do this." Much like you, my sister laughed. And I said, "It's not funny," burst into tears, and said again, "I don't want to do this." But we were in Connecticut, so I did it. In that moment, the decision to attend seminary was just too big for my heart to handle. There were so many fears and so much uncertainty. I knew God had called me into ministry, but I had no idea what to expect over the next 3 years. But I did know one thing was certain. God would be faithful, and He has been. One of my biggest concerns moving to Massachusetts with all my family out west was finding a community here. I remember our first free night during orientation, giving myself a pep talk on the way to the dining hall, like, "Okay, Katie, you are not going to go back to your room after dinner. You are going to find something to do. Whatever anyone is doing, that is what you are doing." So when someone sitting near me at dinner said he needed to go to Target to get some stuff for his room, I was like, "Target? I love Target. Can I come to Target with you?" And a group of 4 of us piled into the car, plugged Target into our GPS, and hit the road. And on the way, we talked about how we all really wanted deep, solid friendships through our time in seminary. And we agreed when we got back to campus, we would have a serious conversation. We were very intentional young first years. But we never actually had that serious conversation that night. But I ended up in a soul care group with one of them. I went to one's wedding last summer and took breaks from finals to pray for his PhD application. And the other one is now my husband. In addition, we can all now get to Target without aid of GPS. So God was very faithful for my desire for relationships and community during my time here. God's also been faithful in revealing Himself through His Word and through my studies. He has shown me time and again I can grasp weighty theological concepts. I can answer those difficult questions. And I can admit that there are some questions I still can't answer. God was faithful to meet me in chapel twice a week. God was faithful to fight the lies that I was tempted to believe about myself and my ministry. God was faithful when my first job interview went pretty terribly, and He reminded me of His call on my life even then. And I know I am only one story among many. God was faithful to Joseph. Joseph was betrayed by brothers who were supposed to have his back. He was not even sold, really, but given into slavery and falsely accused of a crime and sentenced to prison. And then he rose to become second in command in all of Egypt. He was able to feed his family with grain because of what he suffered. So he could say to those very same brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." God was faithful to His people Israel. He heard their crying, suffering in slavery in Egypt. He sent Moses to deliver them. He dealt 10 plagues on Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and the Israelites were set free. God was faithful to Ruth. But before she became a mother in the line of King David and King Jesus the Messiah, she lost her husband, left her homeland, and left her people. God was faithful to Saul, who was a proud persecutor of Christians. He blinded him in order to open his eyes and gave him a new name, a prolific ministry, and a thorn in the flesh that caused him to rely on God's grace in the midst of his weaknesses. And God has been faithful to you too. Some of us have been here far longer than 3 years, and some of us have been here shorter. Some of us have gotten married during our time in seminary, and some of us have felt the door close on relationships and mourned that anticipated future. Some of us have had children in seminary, and some of us have lost them. Some of us have a job that we're going into, and some of us don't quite have that figured out quite yet. But one thing I can say with certainty about each of our stories is that God has been faithful. It has looked differently for you than it has for me, but God's faithfulness is firm and secure and certain. God's faithfulness is as diverse as all the people gathered here today. Today, as we celebrate our achievements, let's look back on our time in seminary and see that evidence of God's faithfulness. Even in the discouragements, the heartache and the rejection, the fear, the loneliness, even in the racing the deadlines, the struggling to understand, the failing to perform as we desired, in the moments when we are actually feeling like we're backsliding in our sanctification, when we've had to ask for forgiveness, the moments when we have believed the lies, God has been faithful. He is no less faithful in those moments than he is on our wedding days or when we get papers back with A's. God is faithful. In Hebrews 3, the author reminds us not to miss out on the chance to enter into God's rest like Israel did in the wilderness. Their lack of faith caused them to wander for 40 years instead of entering the promised land. 12 spies were sent to scope out Canaan, and all 12 saw the goodness and the prosperity of the land that God had promised to give to Israel. But 10 of them said, "We can't do this." Only Joshua and Caleb believed God would be faithful to his word. And Israel sided with the doubters, despite what they knew about God's faithfulness. Despite the fact that God had done these 10 plagues to bring them out of Egypt, they wished they were back in slavery when the Egyptians were pursuing them. So God parted the waters so they could walk through on dry land. And despite the fact that God parted the waters so they could walk through on dry land, they wished they were back in slavery when they found themselves without food in the desert. So God provided manna from heaven and quail. And despite the fact that God provided manna from heaven and quail, they wished they were back in slavery when they found themselves without water. So God provided water from the rock. And despite all of this, they did not believe that God would be faithful to let them enter the promised land. It's easy to stand here and belittle the Israelites for their lack of faith. But then an unexpected car payment or a medical diagnosis greets us. We suffer a loss, or we're hurt, or we didn't get that job that we really thought we were going to get. And we forget about the times that God has parted the waters for us, provided us with manna from heaven, provided us with water from the rock. The good news, though, is that our doubts and our lack of faith do not negate God's faithfulness one bit. In 2 Timothy, the Bible says, "If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself." It is God's nature to be faithful, and he is always who he is. God cannot not be faithful. So as we celebrate our achievements and as we look ahead, with excitement or trepidation or a little bit of both, we are really celebrating God's faithfulness. It's looked different for you than for me, than for anybody else, but God has been so faithful, and God will continue to be faithful. Thank you.